There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
There are stunning developments tonight from sources close to the royal household, suggesting King Charles faces a medical situation far graver than the public has been led to understand. The palace walls didn't crack from noise. They fractured from the weight of what could no longer be kept hidden. Minutes after a confidential health briefing reached senior family members, Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped forward with a statement that stopped the nation cold. King Charles's condition had deteriorated beyond what anyone was prepared to acknowledge, triggering urgent family gatherings about the future, duty, and the unthinkable questions no one wanted to ask aloud. What started as a private medical consultation transformed into the moment the monarchy had to face something it had always tried to avoid. Loss, real loss, visible loss. Before we continue exploring what this means for the future of the crown and the family carrying it, make sure you subscribe so you're notified the instant new details emerge. William did not rush toward the cameras. He approached them like someone walking toward a line he couldn't cross back over, while Catherine stood beside him, her presence so controlled it almost broke him. The official royal functions, those are the ceremonial duties and state appearances that prove to the nation the monarch remains in command, would require immediate restructuring. That phrase carried weight because it wasn't just about schedules. It meant the palace was quietly acknowledging what the public wasn't ready to hear. William's hands held the statement, but his eyes held something far deeper. Catherine watched his shoulders adjust, watched him gather himself, watched the man she married become something the country would need him to be. The future king read the final lines silently once, then twice, and on the second pass, his jaw tightened in a way only she recognized. That small gesture meant everything. Charles remained in his private residence when the statement was finalized, and his absence was deafening. He hadn't been there to shape the words his son would carry to the nation. The monarch wasn't in the room where decisions about his own future were being made. That exclusion hit William harder than any diagnosis could have. It meant the palace was moving forward without waiting. It meant time had suddenly become something they didn't have. The health briefing had arrived after a series of private medical consultations, restricted meetings where specialized doctors delivered findings before any public announcement could be constructed. A medical consultant, in straightforward terms, is a physician with expertise in royal health matters who advises on how conditions affect public duty and official performance. The detail mattered because the family wasn't trading in rumors anymore. They were holding official medical assessments, the kind that change everything. William placed the statement down slowly. He didn't throw it. He didn't pace. That stillness terrified Catherine more than any outburst could have. She saw something shift in his face, something that said he understood completely now. This wasn't about managing a news cycle. This was about watching his father disappear into a title he could no longer carry. She knew those words would be broadcast everywhere, dissected everywhere, misunderstood everywhere, but the cost of them belonged first to the four walls of his family. An urgent message moved through the household. Silent, careful, controlled. No preliminary comments from palace representatives. No softening language from royal advisors. No unofficial denials. Just William and Catherine preparing to speak, and everyone else preparing to listen. That message mattered because one careless word could shatter public confidence, and one false promise could make the monarchy feel like it was hiding something catastrophic. The palace needed precision. The family needed mercy. But Charles's decline had already stolen both. William looked toward Catherine before the final moments, before stepping outside. He needed her eyes. She gave him something deeper than reassurance. She gave him permission to break beneath the composure. That exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it held years of partnership. He understood the weight of what came next. Once the statement entered the world, it would reshape everything. The palace would interpret it one way. The nation would interpret it another. The family would carry an interpretation that neither group would ever fully understand. And William, standing at the center, would have to hold all three interpretations at once. The tragedy shifted from private to permanent, the moment his voice reached beyond the palace gates. For William, it sounded like childhood fears returning in adult form. For Catherine, it was a summons to hold him upright, while everything beneath them shook. For Charles, isolated in another room. It was the cruelest confirmation. Age and illness were taking what he'd fought his whole life to keep. For Camila, it meant stepping into a loneliness no title could dress up or disguise. William examined the statement draft, as though examining something fragile enough to shatter. The heir wasn't just reading words anymore. He was standing in a role he never wanted to claim, through suffering. The heir to the throne, meaning the next person whose shoulders would carry the crown, if the reigning monarch could not, had just become real. Not distant, not ceremonial, real. That realization hit different, because Charles's crisis had pulled the succession from history books into the present moment. The monarchy needed someone steady. The country would be watching to see if William was strong enough. Catherine placed her hand over his, not to stop him from reading, but to keep him from disappearing into the fear that was climbing up his chest. The future princess understood his silence in a way no one else could. She'd watched him carry public expectations his entire life. She understood the difference between words chosen for millions and pain held only for family. Her calm mattered, because if he fractured, the tremor would echo through every palace corridor and across every news broadcast. Charles had made a specific request before the announcement moved forward. The king wanted his son and daughter-in-law to carry the news. Not a medical director, not a communications officer, not some distant official whose name no one would remember. A communications officer, in clear terms, is a palace staff member trained to shape public messages about royal matters. That choice mattered because Charles was making an unprecedented decision. He was trusting the future of the monarchy to speak through his heir's voice. He wanted power, certainly, but he also wanted love, visible in how that power was announced. Camilla received her notification separately, in private, and something inside her hardened when the door closed. The Queen Consort didn't call anyone. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, her face becoming pale in ways no makeup could conceal. Her position, her status, her years beside the king felt suddenly useless against what was coming. Camila had supported Charles through difficult periods before, but this felt unrecognizable. This wasn't gossip about the family. This wasn't internal palace tensions. This was the king's body failing, forcing impossible decisions, forcing the palace into changes that would reshape everything she thought was permanent. A palace official, meaning a senior staff member with authority over royal operations, quietly removed a scheduling folder from Charles's office. Schedule folders contained the official diary, upcoming visits, international engagements, and ceremonial appearances planned months in advance. That removal mattered because silence and action spoke louder than any statement. It meant some commitments might be postponed, some might be cancelled entirely, some might never happen as originally planned. William noticed the empty space where the folder had been. Catherine saw his expression shift when he understood what that absence meant. Camilla, in another part of the palace, heard a door close softly and understood the machinery was already changing. The announcement had shaken the palace as an earthquake shakes the ground. But the deeper rupture was still developing beneath the surface, invisible but spreading. William knew it existed. Catherine could feel it. Charles had been preparing for it, and Camilla, increasingly isolated, was beginning to understand that the confirmed health crisis was only the beginning. To understand why this moment carried such devastating weight, the palace had to look backward to the exact moment when fear became real. Every royal crisis has a turning point that later becomes impossible to ignore. This one didn't begin with a public appearance going wrong. It didn't begin with a collapse or a headline. It began during an evening at a royal residence when something shifted in the king. It was late afternoon, the light was fading, and the family had gathered for what was meant to be an ordinary dinner. Charles arrived composed, determined to maintain control, to keep everything normal. The king wanted one evening where family obligations could be discussed calmly, where the future could be planned without panic spreading through the household, where he could still be the authority in the room. Future planning, in straightforward terms, means arranging royal duties and public events that prove the monarchy remains strong and active and engaged. That mattered because those duties weren't decorative. They were proof that the king could still lead. William had been listening to Charles explain the upcoming months, the visits being planned, the ceremonies that needed a monarch's presence. Then Catherine noticed something first. The king paused mid-sentence, not a natural pause, an uncertain pause, a pause that meant his body had interrupted his thoughts. William's eyes moved from the papers on the table to Charles's face and registered the change. The prince had been raised to read rooms and people. He read what was happening now, and it frightened him. Catherine watched the king's fingers grip the table's edge, as if he needed to hold himself steady through sheer force of will. The princess didn't alert anyone. She didn't create alarm, but she understood in that instant that this was beyond normal tiredness. This was a warning signal. His body was speaking what his mouth was trying to hide. Charles attempted to continue the conversation. He pushed through the moment, forced another sentence about dates and locations, then stopped again. That second hesitation carried more weight than any diagnosis. It said the king's resolve was fragmenting. It said something inside him was breaking that he couldn't control. William's chair scraped back against the floor sharply. The sound cut through the room like a blade. The protective son stood up, not for drama, not for effect, but with the clarity that something had shifted, and the room needed to know it. Catherine saw it happen. She watched the future king cross from concern into something else, something protective, something that said denial was no longer possible. The dinner ended without ceremony. Charles excused himself without explanation. No grand address, no reassurance given. A formal medical examination was scheduled after the king returned to his private chambers. A medical examination, in simple terms, is a comprehensive evaluation by trusted physicians to determine what the monarch's body can still manage safely. That mattered because the palace was crossing from private concern to official action. It was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was moving toward preparing for how to adjust. When the extent became clear, Catherine found William alone afterward, standing in a corridor near Charles's room. The prince wasn't moving. He was standing there, like someone trying to decide whether to enter or run. He didn't speak at first. He couldn't. Catherine understood that look. She'd seen him carry responsibility his entire life, but this was different. This was a son learning that his father's weakness could become the pivot point for the entire nation's future. The princess stayed beside him, and her presence told him everything. They both understood something had broken that couldn't be repaired. They could only move forward now. Charles's medical team began preparing a restructured responsibility plan without informing the wider palace. That plan meant certain duties could be transferred away from the king to protect his health and preserve the institution. It mattered because every transferred responsibility would whisper the same message to anyone paying attention. The monarch wasn't as invulnerable as the public believed. The king wasn't immortal. Something was genuinely wrong. The dinner had exposed the fear, but what came next would expose fractures that no amount of careful wording could hide. The palace had survived scandals, weathered resignations, endured family rifts, and recovered from national crises. But nothing felt as dangerous as what happened in a private room where William, Catherine, Camila, and Charles gathered with the truth between them, like something that could either unite them or destroy them. No cameras present, no carefully orchestrated photographs, no polished statements prepared to soften the moment, just family and the terrible knowledge they all now carried. Camilla demanded clarity before the silence could settle. The Queen Consort wanted to know why she hadn't been consulted on the announcement's wording, why William and Catherine had been positioned to speak first, why Charles's health had been revealed with such stark honesty. The statement released about Charles's medical situation, meaning the official public message about the king's serious decline, mattered because it didn't just explain the illness. It changed the power dynamic inside the palace in ways that couldn't be undone. Charles sat with his hands resting in his lap, diminished by the weight of the moment, present but visibly exhausted. The king didn't interrupt immediately. He watched Camila speak, watched William position himself near the door, like someone guarding both his father and the future, standing behind him, watched the room fracture in real time. William understood why this conversation mattered. If the family broke apart here, the nation would eventually sense it. If trust shattered, if truth became a weapon, the monarchy would hemorrhage from the inside. Camila said the announcement had made Charles appear weak. Her voice carried fear beneath the accusation. William answered with controlled intensity. He told her that hiding the truth would have made the family look callous, and callousness would have damaged the crown far more than honesty ever could. His voice didn't shake, but his hands did. Catherine saw his jaw clench. She saw Camila's face harden. She watched grief transform into something uglier. Catherine stepped forward before the argument could become destructive. The princess didn't raise her voice, but emotion filled every word. She reminded them that Charles was still present in the room, still listening, still human beneath the crown. That mattered because the king's body had already been asked to suffer so much. The palace could not now ask him to watch his family fight over how much pain he was allowed to feel or display. Charles spoke through an account, later documented by a senior household aide, who recorded the conversation privately. The king revealed that he personally approved William and Catherine's involvement in the announcement. He trusted them to balance the monarchy's protection with the nation's right to honesty. "The crown needs steadiness," Charles said, "and steadiness only comes through truth." The son and daughter-in-law he was trusting could carry both. William didn't smile. The prince looked devastated. This wasn't a victory. It was a wound being confirmed. This was the moment William understood completely. His father was preparing to step back. Charles was already accepting what came next. Camilla felt her understanding deepen a moment later. Certain official commitments had already been reviewed, and some responsibilities were scheduled to transition to William ahead of the originally planned timeline. The Queen Consort became very still when she heard that detail, because it was the part everyone had been avoiding saying out loud. Charles lowered his gaze, and the room changed. The king had not only expressed his confidence in William and Catherine, he had confirmed that the succession was already being adjusted. Camila understood it. Catherine felt the weight of it. William carried it. And in that moment, the crisis transcended personal pain and family grief. It became about power shifting. At the moment it was least wanted and most necessary. That truth moved everything from emotion into something harder. Control. And inside the monarchy, control was where things became most dangerous and most revealing. Power inside the royal institution rarely announces itself loudly. It moves through folders of updated duties, through signatures on revised agreements, through who gets invited into meetings first, through which voices get heard last. After the health statement about Charles, one reality became impossible to deny. William was no longer waiting for history. History was being pulled toward him, whether he was prepared or not. And Catherine, increasingly strained beneath the pressure, was becoming the person helping him carry what Charles was gradually releasing. William sat with a revised responsibilities folder open in front of him, but he didn't turn the pages. The prince understood completely what those pages meant. A responsibilities folder contains the official schedules, state visits, ceremonial events, and public commitments for senior royals. That mattered because this wasn't just administrative paperwork. Every page showed a commitment Charles would no longer fulfill, and every new line with William's name represented another step toward a role he'd hoped would arrive decades away. Catherine watched him struggle against the silence. The princess understood that moving forward could look powerful to the world, but inside the family, it felt like grief wearing a uniform. She told William that supporting Charles didn't mean replacing him. It meant honoring the space Charles needed to maintain his dignity. Her words mattered because the palace needed stability, but William needed permission to remain a son instead of just becoming a symbol. Charles's lightened schedule was no longer being treated as temporary. The king's condition had transformed it into a permanent constitutional and emotional shift. Constitutional, in clear language, means anything affecting how the monarchy functions as an institution within the nation's governmental structure. That mattered because Charles wasn't just a father managing a health challenge. He was the reigning monarch, and every cancelled appearance raised urgent questions about succession and the continuity of power. A palace aide entered quietly with papers from the king's office, and the aide revealed, through documented household records, that Charles had already placed William's name on several upcoming engagements before the public announcement. The monarch had understood his decline earlier than anyone around him had acknowledged it. He hadn't been careless. He had been preparing his son. That discovery hit William harder than any explicit command could have. It proved his father had been thinking about the future while living inside private suffering. William looked toward Catherine and finally admitted what he'd been swallowing since that awful dinner. He said he never wanted to carry the crown through his father's pain. The princess didn't offer false comfort or easy reassurance. She simply reminded him that Charles still possessed dignity, still maintained choices, and still had a son strong enough to protect both. The air heard her, but the weight didn't disappear. It only settled deeper into something more permanent. Camila discovered the shift in power when a decision that would have come to her first was processed through William's office instead. The Queen Consort froze when she learned that certain instructions now required the prince's approval before final authorization. Camila had feared her husband's illness. She had feared the uncertainty. But influence, moving without warning, felt like a different kind of abandonment. She understood how quickly a crisis could rearrange the people around you. Charles remained nominally at the center, yet the actual machinery had begun rotating around William. Catherine saw it. Camila felt it. The prince couldn't pretend anymore that this was temporary. Power hadn't arrived with fanfare or ceremony. It had arrived quietly, through changed duties, careful rewording, and one father preparing his son to carry weight that had become unavoidable. By the next morning, the palace had stopped asking what had happened. It was responding to what couldn't be undone. Morning came, but the palace felt wounded instead of awake. The announcement about Charles had spread faster than any staff member could contain it. And inside the household, every corridor seemed to hold a different fear. Staff whispered over rearranged schedules. Aides removed names from briefing papers. Camilla stood beside a window, watching the outside world continue while her entire existence was shifting. Camilla watched someone remove Charles's upcoming engagement card from the master board. The Queen Consort didn't ask them to stop. She just stared as the card disappeared into someone's pocket and watched her own face shift from shock to deep grief. An engagement card is a scheduling notation for an official royal appearance, a public commitment the monarchy has made. Removing it meant Charles might no longer be present at his own event. That mattered because his absence wouldn't be hidden behind palace walls. Every empty chair, every cancelled visit, every rescheduled ceremony would speak for him in ways official statements never could. William received his first call before the household had finished processing the announcement. The prince hesitated before answering because every call now sounded like another demand being placed on him. A senior royal official, meaning an experienced palace staff member with authority over major decisions, explained that comprehensive schedule revisions had begun immediately. That mattered because the family wasn't waiting to see what developed. The palace was already moving, already adjusting, already preparing for a reality everyone hoped wouldn't come, but everyone understood was arriving. Catherine listened to William's responses grow shorter with each call. The princess recognized that brevity is control, not coldness. She understood he was being asked to prepare for expanded public responsibilities, not as honor or recognition, but as urgent necessity born from his father's decline. The future king was being pulled forward while trying desperately to remain a son. Catherine witnessed the pain of that impossible split before anyone else even recognized it existed. Charles's reduced schedule triggered discreet calls to senior family members throughout the morning. The king hadn't removed himself from center, but his condition forced everyone else to move before the public understood how serious the situation truly was. That mattered because the monarchy depends on appearing continuous and unbroken. Continuity means the crown must look steady even when the family behind it is shattered. William understood this. Catherine knew it. Camilla felt it most painfully when another folder left Charles's office for William's. The palace quietly produced two different versions of the next public statement. One version sounded hopeful and optimistic. The other sounded far graver and far more honest. A public statement is the official message released when the royal household wants to control how information reaches the nation. That mattered because two different versions meant uncertainty. It meant no one could promise comfort. It meant the next words might either calm the country or deepen the wound the nation was already beginning to feel. Catherine learned through a confidential briefing that Charles had specifically requested she remain close to William during all major meetings and discussions. The princess absorbed that quietly, but it struck her deeply. The king wasn't just trusting his son with responsibility. He was trusting her to steady him when the burden became too heavy to carry alone. William looked at Catherine when she told him, and for one moment, no title mattered. Just two people standing inside a truth that was reshaping their entire lives. Camila experienced another moment of isolation after the aide left, and she understood that grief was becoming visible through small actions. Cards disappearing, calls being rerouted, draft statements being prepared for futures no one wanted to imagine. William heard his next assignment and couldn't move right away. Catherine watched him gather himself. Charles waited behind a closed door, holding words only a father could speak to his son. When William finally enters the king's private chambers alone, the crisis becomes simple in the most painful way. A king preparing to release what he's held his entire life. His heir learning to receive it. No titles between them, no aides, no protocol, just the two of them, and the words neither of them wanted to need. Catherine waited in the corridor, while the monarchy had no shield between heartbreak and truth. William entered alone, because Charles had requested it that way. The prince left Catherine outside the door, even though every part of him wanted her presence beside him. A private royal chamber, in simple words, is a protected space where family matters can be discussed freely, away from staff and outside eyes. That mattered, because this wasn't about strategy anymore. This wasn't about messaging or public perception. This was about a father telling his son what suffering had taught him. Charles looked at William with a tenderness the monarchy rarely permitted. The king understood completely now. The announcement had shifted everything. The future king had carried the first shock publicly, and the nation was already beginning to decide what it meant. The monarchy had to prepare itself for a painful new reality, meaning the institution and the family had to adjust to reduced duties, shifted roles, and heavier responsibility falling on younger shoulders. That mattered because no one could pretend this was a difficult week that would pass. This was the beginning of a new chapter written in heartbreak. Charles told William he was sorry, not sorry for becoming ill, not sorry for needing help, sorry that the burden had arrived this way, through fear instead of planning, through crisis instead of calm preparation. William lowered his head before speaking. He said he wasn't angry at carrying the burden. He was afraid of losing his father inside it. Those words shattered the distance that had always existed between them. Suddenly, there was no crown, no institution, no expectation, just a father and son holding on to each other while everything else fell away. Charles reached for William's hand. The gesture was small, but it carried decades of things they had never said, easily. The king had spent his life inside duty, inside discipline, inside the weight of institutions. The prince had learned early how heavy silence could become. Now both men sat with the truth, finally exposed. Charles was still the monarch, but he was also a father, asking his son to be brave before either of them had prepared to be brave. Charles then explained, through a recorded private conversation later preserved in palace archives, why he had chosen William and Catherine to carry the announcement. The king wanted the public to see continuity, wrapped in compassion. Continuity means the monarchy doesn't appear broken when one person steps back. That mattered because the people needed reassurance. But Charles also wanted honesty. He wanted the nation to see the future without feeling abandoned by the present. He wanted them to see that love didn't disappear when duty changed. William listened without interrupting. The prince understood that Catherine had been chosen not as decoration, but as genuine strength. Charles trusted her steady presence, her sound judgment, and her ability to hold the air steady when grief threatened to become panic. The king made one thing absolutely clear. Camila had to be protected from humiliation, but she could not control the emotional truth of the announcement. The queen consort's pain was real, but the public deserved honesty more than the palace deserved comfort. William rose slowly when the conversation ended. He didn't look relieved, he looked transformed. Charles watched him go with mixed emotions, knowing the son who entered had carried fear into the room, but the man who left carried resolve that would hold the nation steady. Catherine saw his face the instant the door opened. She understood before he spoke. The private pain had finally been articulated, but outside the palace gates, a nation was already deciding what the moment meant for their future. By midday, the story had escaped palace walls and spread everywhere. Homes, workplaces, streets, trains, everywhere people stopped what they were doing and simply stared. The confirmed health crisis about King Charles became more than a royal update. It became a collective pause, a national moment. And at Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered not for celebration, but for something quieter and more profound. Recognition that something was changing. William saw the first public reaction on a muted monitor, and for a moment he couldn't move. The announcement dominated every conversation because he and Catherine hadn't hidden behind an institutional statement. They had carried the truth themselves, with grief visible, and duty visible, and love visible all at once. A royal update, in straightforward terms, is an official message from the palace about something significant affecting the family or the institution. That mattered because this update wasn't about travel or ceremony or celebration. It was about the king's health and the future of the monarchy. Catherine stood near William as broadcasters replayed his words again and again. The princess heard presenters describing the moment as a defining test for the monarchy, focusing on William's restraint and her calm presence beside him. That mattered because the public was no longer judging only the news. They were judging who looked prepared to carry pain. Catherine understood that her stillness had become part of the message itself. A small crowd gathered beyond the palace gates. One elderly woman placed a white flower against the fence and whispered that the king had looked tired for so long. Buckingham Palace, for context, is one of the monarchy's primary working residences and the most public symbol of royal life. That mattered because people didn't gather there by accident. They came because a king's health made the symbol feel human. William watched that moment and looked away. The prince wasn't ashamed of grief. He was shaken because strangers had witnessed what he'd been carrying privately since that awful dinner conversation. Catherine noticed his reaction and stayed close without speaking. She knew the future king could face a nation, but facing a nation's sorrow for his father was something entirely different. A major newspaper featured the headline, "The heir emerges as king falters. William and Catherine guide the nation through darkness." The words landed hard because they made the power shift feel official, even before every change had been publicly announced. A front-page headline is the dominant story placement that tells readers what matters most. That mattered because the public had already chosen the image that would define the period. One broadcaster reported that the defining image wasn't a crown or a balcony or ceremonial regalia, but Catherine standing beside William as he confirmed the hardest truth of his life. The princess heard that line later through a recorded media analysis, and it unsettled her. She hadn't stood there to become symbolic. She had stood there because William needed her, because Charles trusted her, because the country needed someone to represent steadiness. Camila heard the public reaction from another room and understood that the nation was already emotionally shifting toward William and Catherine. She felt the sting of being displaced, but she also understood why it was happening. Charles's illness had created uncertainty, and uncertainty searches for something to hold on to. The king had made clear where that steadiness should come from. The world had reacted with shock, but the final interpretation belonged to the people living the heartbreak from inside the institution. In the end, the confirmed health crisis about King Charles did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped it bare. It revealed the fear beneath the ceremony, the love beneath duty, and the cost of carrying a crown through pain instead of celebration. William and Catherine didn't simply deliver news. They carried a wounded family through its most human hour and transformed the meaning of leadership in ways history would remember. Charles accepted his changed role with quiet dignity. The king set down his pen after signing the revised duty schedule and looked toward William with pride and sorrow mixed together. A revised duty schedule means a changed list of official responsibilities reshaped to protect the king's health while maintaining institutional stability. That mattered because this was not surrender or defeat. It was a father choosing truth before appearance and a king choosing his son's future before his own comfort. William didn't smile when Charles looked at him. The prince understood everything that look conveyed: succession, in plain language, means the order of inheritance for the crown when the reigning monarch can no longer serve. That mattered because the public had stopped seeing succession as distant tradition. They now saw it as a living burden, carried by real people with real fear, real grief, and real love underneath every title. Catherine stood beside William afterward, not speaking for him, not taking the moment from him, but giving him strength to stand when his grief threatened to become visible. The princess had become more than a steady presence. She had become the quiet force that helped the heir maintain himself when the family's private pain became a national turning point. William knew it. Charles knew it. The entire palace felt it. Camilla's heartbreak remained genuine. The Queen Consort had lost the familiar rhythm beside Charles, and she had watched decisions move toward William and Catherine faster than she could emotionally process. But Camila finally understood the hardest truth. Protecting the king meant accepting the future he personally trusted to them. Her pain didn't disappear. It simply stopped resisting what was true. Charles had prepared this transition emotionally before the rest of the palace understood what was happening. Through documented private records preserved in palace archives, Charles's choice became unmistakable. He had chosen honesty over secrecy at the most painful moment of his life. He didn't want the monarchy to hide behind polished language. He wanted the country to witness honesty, steadiness, and family love standing together. William carried that honesty. Catherine gave it grace. Charles gave it permission. And Camila, wounded but no longer resisting, accepted that sometimes love means releasing control and trusting what comes next. This was not merely tragic news about a king's failing health. This was the moment William and Catherine became the emotional guardians of the crown. There are no remaining questions left unanswered. Charles gave the monarchy honesty. William gave it strength. Catherine gave it grace. And together, they transformed a moment of sorrow into a solemn passage of necessary change. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.